You ever watch a boxing match
Yeah.
where, like, one fighter is just absolutely dominating the early rounds? I mean, landing every single clinical punch, just putting on an absolute
Yeah,
clinic,
oh, they're winning on the scorecards by a mile.
right, by a mile. But then you get to, say, round 10, and the guy landing all the hits looks completely exhausted. Like,
Huh.
he's sweating profusely, he can barely hold his arms up. And the guy who's been taking all those hits is just, well, standing there in the corner,
Yeah.
catching his breath, smiling.
Right, it's the classic rope-a-dope. I mean, the dominant fighter is technically winning the round, but they are totally losing the war of attrition. The sheer physical toll of, throwing all those heavy punches has just completely drained them.
Exactly. And that exhausted fighter, well, that's the United States military right now.
Yeah.
And the opponent smiling in the corner, that's Iran.
Yeah, it's a really stark comparison.
It is. And if you really want to get to the core of complex topics without feeling overwhelmed by, just a total information overload, you have to look past the explosions and the tactical
You
wins.
really do.
So today on this deep dive, we're pulling apart this fascinating paradox from an analytical piece called The Asymmetric Cost of Victory. And our mission today is to figure out how the United States can be absolutely dominating on the battlefield against an asymmetric threat while simultaneously losing the broader war.
Yeah, it's a huge shift in how we need to think about conflict.
Right. And to see how this happens, we have a really clear focus today. We need to compare this current conflict to past wars by tracking two very specific things.
Hmm.
First, we're going to identify the initial goals. And second, we have to unpack the rising, slower-moving, hidden costs, because those costs inevitably creep in and change the entire math of the conflict.
They absolutely changed the math, and it is a critical distinction to make because, well, we have a really bad habit of conflating tactical dominance with strategic victory.
We do. We see things blow up and think, okay, we won.
Exactly. But if you look at the historical data from the text, especially the precedents set by the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan, there's a very clear pattern.
Right. Both of those started with incredibly clear, easily definable initial goals, didn't they?
They did. I mean, the goals were things like dismantle a specific regime or root out a specific terror network. And the U.S. applied just overwhelming, undisputed force to achieve those initial goals almost immediately.
The tactical dominance was total. Like
Yeah.
the precision strikes, the advanced systems, the global reach. You watch those initial days of those past wars, and it looks like a flawless execution of military doctrine.
Unmatched execution, really. But the historical warning in the source material is about what happens the day after the regime falls or, the network scatters.
Like goals change.
Right. Those clear initial goals blur. They morph into these prolonged, incredibly expensive engagements with, frankly, decidedly mixed outcomes.
Yeah.
You transition from the goal of a swift military victory, which, relies heavily on engineering and ballistics and targeting data, to the much more murky, slow-moving reality of nation building or counterinsurgency.
And maintaining logistical supply lines halfway across the planet for literally decades.
Exactly.
Wait, help me understand this, though. Because we have spent decades and trillions of dollars building the most advanced military apparatus on Earth, if military strength and tactical execution have never been America's weakness, why do these incredibly clear initial goals always seem to blur over time? Like, why does the definition of success slip through our fingers?
Well, because the metric for success fundamentally changes. Like, a precision strike is just a math problem. You find the coordinates, you calculate the trajectory, and you eliminate the target.
Right, it's highly technical but straightforward.
Exactly. But stabilizing a fractured region or deterring a deeply entrenched ideological adversary, that is a complex, evolving human problem. When the initial goal is achieved, that massive military apparatus doesn't just pack up and go home.
It has to stay.
Yeah, it stays to manage the chaos it just created. And that is exactly where the hidden costs begin to compound. The text makes it clear that early military success very often creates this false sense of security,
Yeah.
and that masks deeper, slower-moving strategic losses.
It really makes me think of, like, sprinting the first mile of a marathon at a world record pace.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right, because if you're just looking at the stopwatch at mile 1, you think, wow, I am dominating this race. But you're completely ignoring the lactic acid building up in your legs that's just going to absolutely destroy you over the next 25 miles.
That is a perfect way to look at it. And the lactic acid in this geopolitical marathon, according to the source, is the financial and logistical drain of asymmetric warfare.
Which brings us perfectly to the actual tactics and weapons being used right now. Because this is where the dynamic gets incredibly strange.
It really does.
I mean, we've spent our entire lives hearing about precision strikes as the ultimate military advantage. It's like the hallmark of American power. But when you look at the current ground-level tactics in this analysis, it almost sounds like our greatest technological strength is actually a financial liability in a war of attrition.
Yeah, that's the paradox.
So does having the best, most expensive tech actually become a trap?
It does, and to understand why, you have to think about the underlying mechanics of how these two forces operate. The U.S. relies on highly sophisticated, high-cost precision systems.
Like those interceptor missiles.
Right. We are talking about interceptor missiles that cost anywhere from $2 to $4 million apiece. But Iran and the proxy networks it supports, they rely heavily on lower-cost asymmetric tactics.
So they aren't using million-dollar weapons.
Not at all. They are mass-producing off-the-shelf commercial drone technology, basically strapping explosives to them and launching them for maybe $2,000 or $5,000 a unit.
Wow. So you basically have a $2,000 flying lawnmower being shot down by a $2 million feat of aerospace engineering.
Precisely. And that's why these asymmetric tactics are so much harder to counter and cheaper to sustain. The weaker opponent doesn't need to match the stronger power jet for jet or ship for ship.
They just have to tip the scale financially.
Exactly. They simply have to impose disproportionate costs. They launch a swarm of cheap drones. And the U.S. Navy commander sitting on a $2 billion destroyer, well, they cannot risk letting a $2,000 drone hit their ship.
Because even a small hit is unacceptable.
Right. The radar signature might be small, the payload might be light, but the risk of catastrophic damage or, loss of American life means they cannot afford a single mistake. They have to use the multi-million-dollar interceptor. It is a zero-fail defense environment.
That is wild. It's like trying to swat a swarm of mosquitoes with a solid gold baseball bat.
A solid gold baseball bat, exactly.
I mean, you're going to kill the mosquito, sure. You win that tactical engagement. But you are swinging a deeply expensive asset to do it, and eventually your arms are going to get tired.
And the asymmetry goes even deeper than just the price tag of the weapon. It's actually about the supply chain, too.
How so?
Well, an asymmetric adversary can build these drones in underground workshops using smuggled commercial electronics. It's decentralized and fast, but the United States procures its advanced missiles through a highly regulated, deeply complex defense contractor supply chain.
Oh, right. Red tape and specialized parts.
Exactly. It takes years to build a sophisticated interceptor. You can't just flip a switch and manufacture 1,000 more by next Tuesday.
So even if the Pentagon had an unlimited budget to just keep buying those golden baseball bats, we physically can't build them fast enough to keep up with the mosquitoes?
That's the crux of it. The imbalance allows a weaker opponent to impose these disproportionate costs, gradually eroding the advantages of the stronger power simply by forcing them to consume high-end, scarce munitions just to maintain the status quo.
Wow.
You are bleeding financially and logistically to win battles that, frankly, don't actually change the strategic map. The hidden costs are rising rapidly, and they are entirely separate from battlefield casualties.
But the crazy thing is, that multi-million-dollar missile you just fired doesn't just leave a hole in the Pentagon's inventory.
No, it doesn't.
It eventually works its way into the civilian economy because the bleeding doesn't stop at the military budget. It bleeds directly into your wallet.
Yeah, the domestic and economic hidden costs.
Right. Let's look at the geography here for a second, specifically the Strait of Hormuz and the surrounding waters. You know how critical that region is for global oil trade?
It's a massive artery for the global economy.
Exactly. But what's less visible is the actuarial reality of how the maritime shipping industry reacts to this kind of asymmetric warfare.
Yeah.
How do these military costs actually bleed into civilian economics?
This is where the tactical translates into the everyday, because commercial shipping operates on extremely tight margins and complex insurance models. When tension rises in a maritime choke point like that, and you have cheap drones harassing commercial vessels, well, maritime insurers instantly slap massive war risk premiums on every single tanker or cargo ship trying to pass through.
And we aren't talking about a small fee either.
Not at all.
These premiums can jump from, like, a fraction of a percent of a ship's value to hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single voyage, literally overnight.
Right. And when those premiums become too high or the physical risk just becomes unacceptable to the crews, major shipping conglomerates simply refuse to transit the area.
They just stopped going through the canal entirely.
Exactly. They reroute their entire fleets around the Cape of Good Hope, completely bypassing the Middle East by sailing down and around the entire continent of Africa.
Which adds, what, like 10 to 14 days to a single journey?
Easily 10 to 14 days. And think about the logistical domino effect of that delay. It's not just that the ship burns millions of dollars in extra fuel, it's that the vessel is now tied up for an extra 2 weeks.
Oh, meaning it can't be used for its next scheduled pickup.
Right. That takes massive capacity out of the global shipping fleet. Suddenly, there is a shortage of available shipping containers worldwide, which spikes freight rates globally, even on routes that have absolutely nothing to do with the Middle East.
See, I look at the global supply chain like a human immune system.
Okay, I like that.
What we're seeing in the Middle East is a localized infection, right? It's a regional conflict. But because of how deeply connected the arteries of the global economy are, that localized infection causes a systemic fever.
And that systemic fever is global inflation, because higher shipping costs instantly raise the cost of manufacturing. Manufacturers pass those costs to retailers. Retailers pass those costs to the consumer.
It's a direct chain reaction.
It really is. For the American citizen, a distant geopolitical maneuver transforms into an immediate, unavoidable domestic burden. You feel the systemic fever when you fill up your gas tank, and you feel it when you look at the receipt at the grocery store.
Yeah, a growing sense of financial strain. Because the United States can't isolate itself from these effects. We are just too deeply tied to those global markets. Which really begs the question,
Yeah.
at what point does the domestic economic pain, the higher gas prices, the cost of goods, the inflation, at what point does that outweigh the tactical victories happening thousands of miles away?
Well, that is the exact tension keeping policymakers awake at night. Tactical victories make for excellent press briefings. Shooting down a hostile drone looks great on camera.
Very cinematic.
Right. But persistent inflation and financial strain deeply erode domestic support for any prolonged engagement. If the hidden costs become too high for the public to bear, the strategic value of the military operation is compromised from the inside out.
It undermines the whole effort.
Exactly. You could have the most flawlessly performing weapon systems in the world, but if your domestic economy is buckling under the inflationary pressure of the conflict, you are losing the broader war.
Which means we have to pull the camera all the way back now.
The grand strategy.
Yes, the grand strategy and the opportunity costs.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've gone from the granular math of drones versus missiles to the global supply chain fever, and now we need to look at the whole globe. The U.S. military isn't operating in a vacuum.
No, it has a whole globe to worry about. And this is where the opportunity costs become genuinely terrifying. We talked earlier about the U.S. defense industrial base and the inability to quickly replace those multi-million-dollar interceptors.
Because they take years to build.
Exactly. Military resources are finite. You only have so many ships that can be deployed at once. You only have so many advanced munitions in the stockpile.
And right now, a massive chunk of that finite readiness is heavily concentrated in one specific theater, managing a slowly draining asymmetric conflict.
While the rest of the world watches, the text brings in this broader geopolitical context, specifically the ongoing tensions with nations like China and Russia.
Right, the other major global players.
Exactly. The text poses this unavoidable question. What is being sacrificed today that might be needed tomorrow? Because every single advanced missile fired in the Middle East to swat down a drone is a missile that is mathematically unavailable in the Pacific theater, for instance.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second, though.
Sure.
Isn't this just the cost of doing business when you're a global superpower? Like, if the U.S. wants to maintain international order and keep the sea lanes open, doesn't it just have to eat these costs? Or are you saying this is a specific strategic miscalculation that leaves the U.S. dangerously exposed elsewhere?
Well, based on the source material, the underlying analysis points heavily towards the latter. It fundamentally challenges the assumption that engaging and dominating tactically is always the right move just because you can.
Just because you have the firepower doesn't mean you should burn through it.
Right. If you are burning through your critical stockpile of high-end interceptors and you are running your naval crews to the point of complete exhaustion to counter low-cost threats, you are inherently altering the global balance of power to your own detriment.
You're showing your hand.
You're showing your hand, You're expending your irreplaceable resources, and you are potentially emboldening other global actors. An adversary in another region doesn't have to defeat the U.S. Navy in a head-to-head battle if they know the Navy has already depleted its most critical defensive munitions, managing a proxy war halfway across the globe.
It is exactly like that exhausted boxer in round 10 we talked about.
Totally.
You've thrown all your absolute best punches. You landed them, your form was perfect, but now your arms are heavy, your legs are gone, and there's another completely fresh challenger waiting just outside the ring.
And in that light, you have to completely reevaluate what victory actually means in the 21st century. Winning is no longer just about clearing a specific battlefield or, defeating an opponent in a kinetic exchange.
Right, the definition of winning has to shift. It's about emerging economically stronger, more stable, and better positioned for the future.
Exactly. If a war achieves incredible tactical success and it meets all those clear initial goals with overwhelming force, but the hidden costs ultimately weaken the nation's economic resilience and drastically reduce its strategic flexibility on the global stage.
Then what did you really win?
Right. The long-term value of that win is highly uncertain. It might even be negative. The broader balance, economic, global, and strategic, is actively shifting under our feet while we are entirely focused on the explosions in the sky.
So to synthesize this entire core insight,
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. absolutely controls the kinetic battlefield.
Yeah.
But the cost of maintaining that control has become wildly asymmetric.
Wildly.
We've seen how the initial goals of using overwhelming force quickly mask the rising, slower-moving hidden costs. We've seen the underlying mechanism of why a zero-fail defense posture forces us into an economic trap, trading multi-million-dollar missiles for cheap, mass-produced drones.
Right, the math of asymmetry.
And we've traced how that localized bleeding spikes the fever of the global supply chain, turning a distant maritime conflict into an immediate inflationary strain for you at the grocery store. Most importantly, we've seen how managing this slow drain leaves the military mathematically exposed in other critical theaters.
It all routes back to that central paradox. You can easily win the battle while actively losing the war of attrition. The true cost of victory is hidden in the economics, the supply chains, and the opportunity costs, rather than just the ballistics.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought for you to really mull over on your own.
Yeah, this is the big question.
If overwhelming military force consistently leads to these asymmetrical, hidden economic costs, will future global superpowers eventually have to abandon traditional warfare entirely, simply to protect their own domestic economies from collapsing under the crushing weight of their own victories?
When the cost of winning becomes mathematically indistinguishable from the pain of losing, the entire paradigm of how superpowers project force just has to evolve.
It really does. Keep that in mind the next time you see a headline celebrating a flawless tactical strike. Remember the boxer in round 10. Winning the round doesn't always mean you have the endurance to survive the fight. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Understanding these complex layers, the economics behind the explosions, that is the true shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.